Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Three Techies Banter. Uh, this episode of Three Techies is kind of a little different than others because it's a podcast about podcasting. And as you may or may not know, Sheetal had actually gone out and done this amazing report about the podcast industry. And when we started Relation, I started reading it, of course, was struck with some very strange things. One of them being that the sheer content that is created. So apparently there are 4 million episodes out, 4 million podcasts with n number of episodes. So it will apparently take 400 years to finish listening to them, apparently, if you start listening. But we also have the other side. There is this whole phenomenon that bulk of 50% of podcasts don't make it past the 7th episode. So that's a phenomenon called pod fading, apparently. That's another thing. The other funny thing I came across is that a lot of people record their podcasts in their closets because it apparently absorbs sound of the clothes. So, and to give you a funny one-liner below it, that gives a whole new meaning to coming out of the closet. so, and, but so, but the genre actually lends itself to, in fact, it lends it to a lot of micro genres, So then you have the history of potatoes, how to keep house plants. And there is actually one podcast which is about, it's actually ambient office sounds for people who miss working in cubicles. So
this must be post corona kind of.
So all in all, a very, very interesting space, and Sheetal has dared to venture into it. So I think we'll kind of now roll it over to Sheetal to tell us how she kind of navigated all of this.
So a lot of the findings that he stated are not from the reports that we have done. This is Samiran doing his mad research, which really puts a lot of data into space. But I'm like, just go back to work if you're missing office so much. Why do you need a podcast with ambient sounds? Companies are dying to get people back to work and nobody wants to go back. So that's interesting. Having said that, I think three of us, when we started off, one of the biggest challenges we had is every time we would sit and say, who's listening to podcasts? That was a question we were constantly asking. Who's listening to the podcast? Why are people listening to podcasts? Is somebody in metros listening to podcasts? Is somebody down in tier 2 listening to podcasts? Should we be doing only English? Should we be doing Hindi? These were questions that three of us, I think, have debated over the last 3 years a lot. And we realized that there was nothing which was telling us who's listening to it. So since I run Unpack Research, it made sense to go out there and say, hey, listen, let's go and understand who's listening to podcasts. And that's the starting point for this. We also did very interesting stuff. So we went and met 2,000 plus people to understand just awareness levels, right? How many people are actually aware of podcasts? Because data that we had picked up said that India was the third largest podcast consumer after the US and China. And this was just on the back of the pandemic. And we said, okay, third largest means a lot of people must be listening to it. And we realized only 12% are listening to it. Okay, they're even aware of it. So aware and listening is 12%. And we said 12% of the Indian population is listening, and that makes us the third largest. So can you imagine the potential that this industry has? And so we went and said, okay, has the awareness level shifted? Which was one of the first questions that we checked. And we said, from the 2022 data to now 2024 data, it's shifted. It's gone to 15% awareness, which is not bad, 3% in a couple of years, and on a base as there. So that's something that was interesting to know, that people are listening. We also continue to focus on audio podcasts because we realized that video podcasts are becoming big, but we decided to focus on audio. And we realized that actually a lot of people love audio podcasts. So while video is emerging to be the next big trend, the younger generation prefers video, etc. But I think audio is not dying in a hurry. So for a lot of people who are out there wondering whether I should stay with audio or should I go with video, I think audio is still staying. The challenge may be getting money on the audio piece of it, but audio podcasts are going to definitely be heard. So I think that's really what started us off. Our conversation started me off on this journey.
So the recent election got a lot of focus back on psephology and research, right?
Correct.
So for me also, it was a bit new field, and I was introduced to how the research is done, right?
Correct.
So could you tell a bit about, which cities, I mean, the philosophy of your research for podcast, how
Is it like an urban phenomenon?
Yeah,
is it like, more widespread?
So it is more widespread. So what we did was we partnered with Idea Brew just to understand which cities are actually listening more. So from a listenership data, we picked up top 10 cities of India. So we went to, of course, Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, Bangalore, Calcutta, Ahmedabad, Lucknow, Indore, Patna. The one city which didn't emerge in the top 10 was actually Calcutta. But we went to Calcutta because we realized
people
that
are only
otherwise...
talking, nobody's listening.
You should know as a Bengali. So Calcutta didn't emerge amongst the top 10, but we said we needed representation out of the East in India. So we went to Calcutta. And what caught us by surprise was Jaipur. So Patna, Jaipur caught us by surprise. We didn't think that Patna, Jaipur were going to come into it. But otherwise, the other ones were fairly expected, anticipated, and landed in the sea. So we did 10 cities. We went to 2,170 people just to check on awareness levels and listenership levels. Then we went to 1,800 people who were actual listeners, and these were people who would have heard podcasts in the last 3, 4, 6 months. So we went to listeners, and then we went into a deep dive with the listeners. What we also did, Nilesh, is we identified 100 people who were active listeners of podcasts, and we did a 5-day digital diary with them. So we actually got them to tell us what
A
is
day
on
in the life
a
for
day.
five
Yeah,
days.
so 5 days, what their behaviors were. So we actually got them to send us screenshots of the podcast they were listening to,
Wow.
the platforms they were listening to, why were they listening to it. We asked them to do relationship trees with the podcast to understand what is the relationship that they have with a podcast. Is the podcaster more important? Is the podcast more important? All of that. So 5 days of intense diary work where they were doing tasks. And then we followed it up with focus groups with them. So we actually went into understanding. So we got the data saying, for example, the Ranveer show is extremely popular across the country. Yes, more so in the north than in the south, but extremely popular. So that we got as quant and in the diaries. But why was he so popular was what happened when we did the focus groups with them. So we were able to understand the psychology of why the behaviors were happening while we got all the behaviors from the quantitative and the diaries.
So the question therefore is that obviously this is extensive, but you kind of are doing it by yourself. So is there any comparable industry report that anyone else has done which is as exhaustive or anything comparable anywhere else?
So there are reports elsewhere, but I don't think we've come across a single report which has given you both the quantitative and the qualitative aspects. And the reason why we decided to do the quantitative and the qualitative is everybody puts out quant data, but that tells you what is happening. Nobody's telling you why somebody's
And
behaving
it's
a
very
certain way.
platform specific, isn't it? I mean, people do their own platform. Very few people do cross-platform.
So there are international reports which are there, which are cross-platforms, just to understand.
Okay.
But nobody's done it in India.
In India, right?
So you get global data, but you don't get India data. And the other thing is it's always quantitative. It's never been qualitative. It's never about going deeper into understanding why are you motivated to listen to an audio versus a video, that kind of stuff.
So a quick question, when you mentioned all those cities and, when I see Chennai, Bangalore, Mumbai, let's say, and Patna, Jaipur, I'll come to that. Did you find that is English podcast more or regional vernacular this thing is more famous?
So honestly, I think the growth in India is going to come largely from the vernacular space. It's going to come from regional languages. There are listeners to English podcasts, but The challenge is you're not getting enough content in regional. So, for example, we had this one guy in Ahmedabad saying, I would want to listen to it in Gujarati, but I don't get enough in Gujarati. So, he's listening to Hindi, which is a great substitute for Gujarati. But if you did podcasts in Gujarati, then you would get the listenership of that space.
So does translations work? I mean, in the sense, this is another question that we have always debated, right?
Correct.
Should we
Correct.
translate our podcast to Hindi and whatever, Tamil? But we always run into this issue that you never get the nuance.
And,
right?
and
You never get the-
especially since you did the qualitative analysis, I mean, do people listen to a translated podcast? Probably not, right? I don't
So interestingly, Cuckoo, which does a lot of audiobook translations and sells it, is a very, very large platform, which came as a complete surprise to us. We'd heard of it, but we didn't think it would feature so heavily. Also, Cuckoo is one of those few platforms which gets heavily paid for because people want to listen to books in languages.
You know, it was so strange. My mom listens to it. Yeah?
Correct.
It was very interesting. Yeah,
Wow.
this vernacular content on.
Correct.
Yeah,
So
very
we had these young kids who told us Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the book getting translated. It's a book everybody in a certain generation wants to read. And the fact that it's got translated into a language which is their first language really makes them work for it. So I don't know, Samiran, about the translation bit because I think it's about the nuance. So comedy, for example, in vernacular does exceedingly well because you pick the
Well,
nuance of the place,
Correct.
Right.
totally. And you get it. So English comedy does well, but Hindi does even better, and Bengali. Oh, Bengali joke is a Bengali joke.
No, I get it. I get your point because I guess what it obviously does is if you're doing science and if you're doing science, if you're doing fact-based things, then you can translate because the fact remains the same in another language. But if you crack a reference to context joke in English, very difficult to translate it into Tamil or
Correct.
Any other language because there's no reference at all. Right?
Absolutely, and also regional references are there. So I'm a Gujarati, and everybody knows now the Thepla Dhokla version of Gujaratis. But there are inherent things that if you are a Gujarati, you will understand the behavior and you'll understand the nuance of it, which maybe a Maharashtrian won't get because that's not how the community operates. So I think the future definitely in India is going to be regional.
So if you did it in this year, right? I mean, this whole
23,
research,
24,
23,
yeah.
24. So if you had to summarize the quantitative part of it, you would say that today it is English more, or
No,
I mean,
it isn't.
It isn't.
Hindi is still the largest. So English is the second, but Hindi is the biggest.
But this is very true, Nilesh, of most media. What we see typically, like we used to get very excited, English channels. But then we were told that English news is a
Probably.
microcosm of the regional news. And it's like literally 10x or whatever, a factor of
Absolutely.
something of the regional language. So Hindi and all, much more people are listen and therefore influence. So, what you see in English, you might say, the opinion is so balanced, but that's not what is kind of
Correct.
Yeah,
going
no.
out.
So it's Hindi first. It's the largest, and then you have English, and then all the other languages. The southern languages are kind of catching up, but you're not seeing as much in Kannada and Tamil and things like that. It's not
Chennai
yet
was
come-
there, right?
Yeah,
think
Chennai
on,
is there.
almost on top,
Yeah.
right?
So,
but it will be.
But it's
English
a little
or-
more English and a little less Tamil. But Calcutta, for example, there's some podcasts which are doing exceedingly well in Bengali. The other interesting thing is that, when we went into this research, my assumption was that the older generation would prefer regional and the younger generation would prefer English. To my surprise, no. The younger generation is equally happy listening to regional languages. And it's also very interesting because I remember this one girl who's a Bengali for whatever reasons. Sorry, Samira. But she actually said that it is so important to stay in touch with the roots that she goes back to listening to things in. So she lives in Bombay, but she listens to her podcast also in Bengali because she feels like it's closer to her roots. And that I thought was a very, very interesting thing to figure that the younger generation is going back to listen to it in their mother tongue because it makes them feel connected to the roots.
So yeah, I was looking at that report, and there was one. So why don't you tell us about those couple of those trends that you saw, which were more qualitative now, I'll say, rather than the number-driven trends.
Correct. So when we went into the research, everybody told us that with YouTube coming into podcasts and things like that, it's going to be video all the way and all of that. So when we chose to deep dive into audio, I was a little tentative, saying, should we only do audio? Should we do audio, video, etc.? And we said, no, we'll jump into audio. We can do video in the next report that we do. And so while video is gaining traction, we found that audio is doing exceedingly well. And we asked them why. And they said work from home happened. I'm constantly in front of a screen. So whether it's your laptop or it's your OTT, so television, or it's your phone and your social media. And they said there is so much fatigue and overload on the eyes that they want a detox out of screens. So one of the big reasons for audio podcasts doing well is the sonic respite. So they want to move away from a digital overload and say, okay, I want to listen, I need it. And that will bring me to the second trend. So they want something, but they didn't want it as video.
So it's interesting. I don't know whether it happens to you, and this is the question to you also, whether it was a part of your qualitative research. I have seen personally, when I hear a podcast, okay, there is a certain level of retention of information. When I look at a video, I think for me it drops. And I'll tell you how further it drops. If I look at a video with subtitles, it drops further. I mean, I'm saying retention. I might enjoy it, but I really don't. So there are some movies, where there is a bad audio and you start looking at, the
focus changes.
Somehow and then you are not really. So it's like, for me, I personally felt the pure audio one, my retention was higher. So I would gravitate towards the science, technology, or fact-based, and probably I have never heard a story-based thing. I don't know, so I won't comment.
But I'll tell you this. So you're right that I think in the radio world, I think at least senior radio broadcasters have said that the radio lends itself to imagination.
Correct.
So when you hear a story, so if you are making Star Wars, and you put something on screen, it is what it is. But if you hear Star Wars, you can imagine anything, and my imagination and yours will be completely different. So that experience is, I think, very different. And I don't know if this plays a part or no, that regional language wise, is that one is of course literacy, that not everybody understands English. So if you're comfortable in your native tongue, then you like to listen. And number two is maybe a silly reason, that audio bandwidth is less than video bandwidth. So, it's just reach, right? It means that you can, for the same amount of money, maybe listen.
That might have changed, by the way.
Jio did it. But I can only say that obviously there is some element of audio truth in it, is that even the Prime Minister chooses Man Ki Baat in a audio format, and of course it gets translated, but because obviously he also knows that reach is much more, that maybe
correct.
Somewhere very, very far away, where maybe there is no TV, somebody still has a radio set that is broadcasting.
Correct.
As opposed to a TV. So yeah, there is some truth in this audio business.
So, Nilesh, for what you are saying, we had a couple of them say that I feel मेरा memory loss हो रहा है when I'm watching too much video.
Okay.
I think the other challenge that is happening is that our attention spans are becoming very, very poor, because we have so much of overload. All of us, I don't know, there was a time when I could sit for 2 hours and read a book non-stop. Today I can't. I have to take a break. And I think that's what's happening. So now you have really short passages where you get distracted by something or the other. A WhatsApp pops up, something else will happen. None of us has the bandwidth. So a lot of them are talking about the fact that when you have so much hitting you, and when it's video, you tend to kind of just skim over it. From your perspective of imagination, what we found interesting is that parents are willing to let their kids listen to podcasts more than they're willing to
Do they
listen
know Dirty Diana is out there?
See, this is where I am so happy with the innocence of parents in this country, because they're not aware of Dirty Diana, I think. But the fact is, what they're saying is that today, when you give access to video, right, despite putting all kinds of net nannies and all of that, the kid gets access to certain things. What
Whatever, yeah.
happens with audio is तुम महाभारत सुन रहे हो तो तुम महाभारत सुन रहे हो.
Correct.
That's what
the
happens. It's a
recommendation engine
kahani.
doesn't
or
work
it's-
the way YouTube
Correct.
works.
It doesn't
right?
work that way. Also, the child is watching it or listening to it on the parent's phone, which means there's more control.
True, true.
So to that extent, the exposure, I mean, Dirty Diana and porn to that, in an audio format may not make any sense to a child.
And not so appealing, frankly.
Yeah, correct. So that's another thing. And they all talk about the fact that it allows for imagination to happen. And that's
true,
why I
true.
think audio works very well. Which is why, so if I go to the genres, true crime does exceedingly well.
Okay.
Because a lot of them say that, also, I had a lot of women who said horror and true crime work. Because when you watch or watch true crime, there is a goriness attached to it. When you listen to it, it's in your imagination,
Yeah.
right? So you can control how horrible it gets. It doesn't get as bad as a
But so
video.
the reverse of that, I remember that when we were growing, there was this movie had come which was called Evil Dead.
Yes.
So it was like supposed to be really bad. But they actually said that, watching Evil Dead without sound is not as frightening as watching it with sound.
Correct.
Sound actually has
Has
I mean, it kind of that they are able to build up anticipation
Correct.
and that climax and like this something is going to happen, and that happens with, I'm assuming I'm using music as an audio thing as opposed
Correct.
to a part of the movie. So sound is a big part of all this.
So the first trend that I was talking about was this whole I want a sonic respite. The other very interesting thing one for us was, and this is more the younger generation, millennials and downwards, is they are always filling gaps. They don't want moments of peace with themselves or silence, which is what we are very comfortable with. Our generation, I think, is very okay with that. These guys constantly need to fill it because there is so much loneliness. It is so bizarre. And I had this one girl who spoke so frankly to us. She said, दिन में हम लोग social media में रहते हैं, FOMO हो जाता है. So you're living that because you're saying, oh, this one's gone there, this one's wearing this dress, this one's eating over there, whatever. She says, we know it's fake. Sometimes it's all not true, but we're watching it. And she says, वो FOMO create करता है. And then रात को फिर हम mythology and, motivational speakers को सुनते हैं so that we feel better about ourselves. And it's a cycle. So it's like FOMO, motivation, repeat. That's their life.
Interesting.
But there is a paradox of loneliness. So the more they are on social media, the more lonely they are. And they're constantly filling the gap. And that gap often gets filled in with audio. So that's another one. The third very interesting thing for us, which I think is a global trend but very large in India, is this whole thing of going back to your cultural roots, right? Because what's happened is we've had a breaking down of the whole family system. So I thought that was we know that that's not a metro phenomenon anymore. Tier 2, Tier 3 has also gone into the space. When you have that breaking down, kids now don't have access to cultural roots. So when we grew up, our grandmothers would tell us stories, kahaniyas, all of that, right? Where do you go now? Because either the grandparents are living in different cities, the new age grandparents have a life of their own and they're not looking after the kids, right? So even if they're living in the house, they have their own personal lives. And therefore children are finding these gaps. And what was interesting for us is a lot of them are going to podcasts to get to those cultural stories. So the reason why Mahabharat does very well is, one is it's of course telling you how to live life, but the other is I know what is happening in the roots. A lot of them, like in Calcutta, you will listen to Tagore, right? And things like that. So it's that. Gujarat, you find that there is, old literature which was there, which is getting a revival thanks to podcasts, because that's filling in the gaps, and the need for going back to cultural roots. Whether we like it or not, I think there is a certain changing sense of pride of being Indian. And now you want to know what it means to be Indian. All this while we were aping the West and adapting. Now we're saying, no, I'm proud to be Indian. Now let me go back and figure out
So
mera
is
history
that
kya
that
hai.
Indian podcasts therefore are more popular in India than international ones?
For sure. For sure.
No, and this is very interesting, because if you remember our episode with Amish, right?
Correct.
And he mentioned that essentially the culture part of India is scriptures, and it is passed on from one generation to another through
Oral. Absolutely.
history, right? I mean, so that oral history thing was very, I think Amish talked about it, I read somewhere else also, it's the most powerful form actually of building culture. And I think you're absolutely right. Somewhere I grew up on stories completely. I mean,
All of
from
us.
Everyone.
So I think I can relate with that totally. I
Yeah,
mean,
so
and
the-
it's getting less
It was
and less.
dying,
It's
and
dying.
I think it's got a revival thanks to that. So, you know, what was interesting for us is that amongst the genres, it came across as mythology, and it didn't mean it was one specific podcaster. So down south, you were listening to Mahabharat, but their version of the Mahabharat. And look, that's the truth, right? Our versions of the Mahabharat also change depending on where you are from.
Absolutely.
So down south has a different literature, up north has a different literature, and that's what builds it for you. So I think that was very interesting.
And either which way, I mean, I'm pretty sure with the kind of access to media and everything youngsters have today, reading that Mahabharata, and I have actually picked up the original Ramayana and tried to read once. It's very difficult to read the actual scripture. So story is the only and best form of actually propagating.
It's like
You can't
literally
expect-
transcribed literally. I mean,
correct,
you
correct.
cannot.
You can't read it
Correct.
today. Now you can't read
Correct.
it. Sorry.
So even the Bhagavad Gita, right?
Yeah.
You can read the Bhagavad Gita and assimilate, but when somebody like
Correct.
one of the spiritual leaders comes and tells you the story, and actually, how should I say, demystifies all of it for you and puts it in a cultural context, I think it makes it easier to assimilate that.
Exactly.
That's it. That's what people are looking at, and that's quite interesting.
So, the life of a podcaster is really, really tough. As we have said earlier, the attention span of a human being is less than that of a goldfish. So, it is like less than 8 seconds. So, you're going to catch them in that much time. However, there are some very die-hard podcasters. So, apparently, the world record for the longest podcast is held by 2 Australians, which is 36 hours non-stop talking.
Wow.
So that's what I mean by die-hard podcasters. But I think for all of us, we've always struggled with this thing, is that, what does the creator, the podcaster do, and, how does the ecosystem grow? We keep on talking about this ecosystem in other areas. So one is the podcaster making the effort, promoting, doing all this. And then there is the, promoters, the aggregators, the platforms and all that. And which kind of ties into what we left off is what is the future then? It cannot just be individual excellers, trying to push their way. So there has to be something more happening. So, what's that outlook looking like? Does anybody have any great insights there?
So, Samiran, as part of the research, we also interviewed some podcasters, right? Because we wanted to get... So the interesting thing is that we actually said we would also get the platforms to come and speak to us. Mm-hmm. And we approached all of them, I think, practically. None of them was willing to give us any information. So I think they're all holding on to this information is power kind of a space. So we decided to drop that part of it. We spoke to everyone, I think. At least the large ones. But we said, at least let's get the podcaster perspective. So from a audience retention, is it 7 seconds, etc.? That was another question. So there's lots of questions that the report answers in terms of what is a good time for duration for the podcast. When do they listen to podcasts? Like all of us are wondering, right? Do you listen to a podcast in the morning? Do you listen to it at night? When do you listen to a podcast? So the report answers all of that. I went in with the thought, because everybody kept saying we don't have attention spans. we do long podcasts, 30, 45 minutes. And I know we started with 1 hour and we've dropped it down to 30 minutes, saying, are people dropping off, etc. People listen. So I think content is king still holds. So you have, most of the consumers say between 15 to 30 minutes is a good size, right? But if you look at the Zero Da guy, right? His podcasts are very long, and they're 2 hours sometimes, and people are listening to it. They may not listen to it at one stretch,
but they cover it.
But they finish the entire thing. And the reason why they do that is because they say that the content is extremely, extremely strong and powerful. So when you learn something, when something adds value to your life, then you are willing to give it. So we had so many people who said, oh, I listen to it in half-hour bits. So in the morning, I listen to half an hour. I listen to it in the afternoon or evening for half an hour. And I cover a 1 hour podcast. So it happens. So depending on whether the content is really powerful or not. So you have an Ankur Wariku who does bite-sized, and then who also does learning but does bite-sized. And then you have the Zero Da guys who do it for really long
Even the Bombay
episodes.
guy,
Correct.
that one
He does a very long podcast.
very long one, and yeah, like you said, depending on what you're getting out of it.
Correct. So I think content still rules. So that decides whether your podcast will be heard or not. Having said that, every single podcaster told me that you get into podcasting only if you have the passion for podcasting. If you get into it thinking that I'm going to become a billionaire, it's a Joe Rogan, which rarely happens in India.
Rarer than a unicorn.
Correct. So that is not the role of podcasts, because I think, unfortunately, the ecosystem, podcast is being treated as secondary to music. So whether it's a Spotify, Ghana, Wink, whatever, they all treat music as the primary source and podcasts as the secondary source, despite the fact that consumers are now listening to podcasts. So a couple of years ago, one podcast used to be there. Now people, as they mature, they go pick up a second podcast and a third podcast. So they are increasing the number of podcasts that they're listening to. But I don't think that the ecosystem is pushing for it. I think it's really the podcasters and the creators who are creating that ecosystem. So they are the ones who are promoting it on social media, and then somebody discovers them and then gets hooked onto it. So that's very strange, because the platforms are not doing it at all.
That's very strange. I mean, and we are saying 12, 13, 15% penetration in a country like India, and we've got 85% unpenetrated. So it's that whole thing, right? If the market grows, everyone will grow, but
Correct.
still...
But the ecosystem is not as supportive. So it's very strange. So one would have thought that platforms will do a lot more to grow it, because then it makes sense. Then you can get the advertising. The other thing is, we also asked consumers if they were okay with advertising on podcasts, right? Because that's a big question. And the truth of the matter is that they're saying, so will you pay for a podcast, or would you have an ad on a podcast? Most people have now got trained that I will listen to an ad, because YouTube's trained you, right? You see the 5 seconds or 10 seconds of ad if you want it free. I think the consumer is prepared. As long as you don't, in the middle of a crime story, in the middle of, the most serious moment, you don't put an ad in, they're okay. The other interesting thing is, podcasters communicating brands has far more weight than just an ad, because there is now a relationship that has been built with the podcaster, right? So podcasters as brand ambassadors is a big thing, but I don't think brands are leveraging that. And so advertisers are missing out on it, because everybody is trying to use a traditional method of how many views, how many downloads, how many listens, how many whatever. But tell me one space where you get somebody listening to a podcaster or anybody for 30 minutes, undivided. That's where you've got to start thinking of it differently, and not just saying, I'll dump an ad in it or I will do something. So it's about really rethinking the way you would engage with your consumer, which I don't think anybody is doing. So 30 minutes of attentive listenership versus 3 million followers. That's the trade-off that you're doing. But I think that's where advertisers are falling. The platforms are not really promoting podcasts. Spotify does a bit of it, and so does geo in that sense. So then promoting podcasts within their own space. But again, a lot of podcasters will tell you that if I have to pay so much to promote the podcast, it makes no sense. The other thing that podcasters are doing is this is like the top of the funnel for them. So it's not really bottom of the funnel where. So the podcast is really a promotion space, and then business is coming from elsewhere.
Elsewhere, it's like branding for other things.
Yeah, so that's where the challenge is. And I think the other big issue is that we need to bring in quality control. Because like you said, 4 million podcasts with multiple episodes. But what is the sense check on the quality of the podcast? Because let's say I get introduced to a podcast and then it turns out to be a crappy quality podcast, then I drop off and I never come back. So that's something I think everybody says, oh, it's easy to do a podcast, let me do a podcast. But it doesn't work like that. You've got to give it quality production for it to do.
But shouldn't that
well
be like a market decided? I mean, in the sense, if it's bad, they will not listen. If it's good, they will listen.
But the
or is it
problem
because the whole
is-
industry is getting a bad name?
No, it's not just bad name. But the issue is, I'm just thinking what Sheetal just said. That if I am on my walks, I listen to a music. I now want to switch to a podcast, and if the first podcast I hear is crappy, I may never come back to podcast itself to search, and that might be true because I was just making a parallel, right? You have access to even put your music up there,
Correct.
right? Very easily. But the thing is that, you may never get heard because there are really good music there.
Correct.
But podcast you might, because there is no such like barring one or two, there is not defining brands in podcasts. So you might pick up a one which is really crappy,
But
and then it
basically,
goes for
you're
a
more
toss.
embarrassed of as yourself singing than talking. That is what it means. Like,
No, so that's a different thing. But you're right. See, in a nascent category, music is not nascent.
Yeah.
no, of course, it's a
Right?
mature category. I
It's a
agree.
mature category.
I
You
agree.
know your artists, you know the playlists, you create those playlists. It's all of that is there. Podcasting is a very nascent space. The
True.
journey of the consumer is right now at the first level, right? We are not a
Correct.
mature market, unlike the US, for example. We're not as mature as a market. Now, in an immature market where somebody is experimenting, if the first experience is bad, you're going to say, I'm never going to
Yeah.
go back to it.
Yeah.
The industry loses. And I think that's where the need for quality check and making sure that
Correct.
we're putting out quality product is both on the creator and on the platform.
So I would just recommend that people just start with Three Techies Banter. It's the best place to start.
Start the podcasting, listening podcast.
Absolutely.
Totally agree. So if I had to just summarize what you were trying to say, advertising, there is no support from advertising. There is no support from platform. So it's essentially a creator-driven,
Solo
creator-led kind of a model. Probably in the Web3 world,
It's not-
podcast would be the king.
Correct.
But-
And think about it. If a creator-led piece is getting you 12%
Yeah.
listeners, and which is the third largest market in the country, in the world, then where do you think is the potential of this space, right?
Yeah.
And the more you get into audio and video both, so YouTube Music is creating confusion right now, but I think at some point in time they will stop creating confusion because most people get a little lost when you say audio podcast, video podcast,
They should
etc.
just start calling it Tubecast or something like that. No, I think.
Maybe that's a way for YouTube to brand it. But there is something which is available there. But I think there is a lot more that this industry needs to do.
I had heard, I think, I don't know whether we talked about, I think one of the biggies, either it was Amazon or Netflix, they did kind of put up a lot of budget at one point of time for podcast, but it just didn't take off. In US, it was not globally, but they were trying to, but yeah, I think some impetus from platform is needed. I mean,
And sustained, I think. This is not like it's not like like she was like a Gujarati businessman, like it's like 1,000-day plan.
Correct.
I mean, you have to kind of put 3 years into a
Correct.
thing, and then you will see some pay.
Absolutely.
No, and I like what Sheetal mentioned, and I hope some advertisers are listening about it. And because just if a person is listening to someone for 30 minutes, plus minus 10, it's a big area where you will listen to that person if that person talks about a brand, right?
Correct.
And hopefully, I mean, yeah, it might also get bad name at some point of time, but if the brand is kind of in line or gels with the theme, it will be a very powerful message. Yeah, I mean, rather than arbitrarily looking at a hoarding or some.
No, definitely.
And one can learn from various things, right? So 5 second, 10
Yeah,
second, whatever. And you give them a skip option if it comes to that. But
Yeah.
point is that there is potential. And the point is that there is, and there's a relationship, okay?
Correct.
So the
That was
biggest
the-
thing
yeah.
that we figured out in this research is also they actually build a relationship
With
with
the
the podcaster. And that could be very, very powerful because you don't. I mean, look, what is your relationship with film stars, right? It's a one-way relationship.
Yeah.
Whereas in a podcasting, it can easily become a two-way relationship where you can have interactions where it's not completely inaccessible. That potential which is available, I think a lot of brands are not looking at to
So
leverage.
that brings me to a very quick, interesting question just popped in. Is there a space for live podcasting?
Interactive.
Interactive live?
I'm sure there is, but you're
Most of these podcasts are recorded, right? Do you
No, there are
think?
lots
I'm
of
just
live
thinking
ones.
suddenly
There are live podcasts that what is that? The Infinite Monkey Cage. So
Yeah.
that one.
then that interaction
Goes up.
possibility goes
But
up.
that's the point, Nilesh, that if you explore, you will find that this works. So it's like a LinkedIn Live. Why did
Correct.
it do well? It's because somebody experimented with it. I'm sure
So
a
it's a
podcast
chicken
live
and egg,
works.
right? I mean, I think that
Yeah,
Infinite Monkey Cage, the BBC, I guess, sponsors it. Maybe the podcasters are very good, but then they get an audience and it happens in
Correct.
front of a live audience and stuff like that.
So the potential is there. It's how you take this format and work with it, which is going to make the difference. So I think if we can shift the needle from 15% awareness to 30% awareness and listenership, the game changes because the numbers change
Yeah, absolutely.
dramatically. So yeah, I think there is potential, audio, video, whichever way we decide to go, but there is. And I think that's something we should kind of look at. And that's why I think I've always said, let's continue with Three Techies Banter, because I think there is potential in this space.
Correct.
So, think the $1 million question, Sheetal. Where do we get this report?
Yeah, so it's not available for free, for sure. So if you go to our website, which is unpackresearch.com, it is available on the website. It's also available on the Idea Brew website. So it's available for a small sum on our websites.
Fantastic.
Great.
So with that, I think thanks a lot, Sheetal. Today you were our guest in a way.
I know, it feels so strange.
Yeah. So that brings us to an end of another episode of Three Techies Banter, a podcast about podcast this time. And we'll continue our banter next time.
This reminds me of the podcast we did with you when you went and attended.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really feeling very
Left out
inferior
now.
right now.
You literally-
I need to do something.
Yes. So it reminds me about the time when we spoke
Yes.
about all the
CES.
experiences
CES,
you
yeah.
had at the CES. So I think it's just one of those moments. So, Miran, time you picked up your bags and went somewhere and did something. Thank you
Great.
guys,
Thank
and
you.
hope that you find enough in this conversation to want to go and buy our report. It will add a lot of value to your decision making on whether you should invest in podcasts as a medium or not.